Hi there, welcome to the channel. Today I'm going to be swapping out my steering box. This is my second steering box. So Death Wobble killed my factory steering box. I replaced that one with a PSC OEM replacement, and now I'm doing my third steering box. Like they say, third time's a charm. Check out my install.
I haven't been happy with how lively my steering has been for quite some time now. In washouts, my wheels flop back and forth, even over small obstacles like stumps. The play is evident. In deep notches, it appeared to almost power out, and just gave up trying to point the tires in the direction I wanted them to. So it's time for a new steering box. The weather has not been conducive to running trails lately. It's either been too cold or way too warm. So I spent the last couple months in the shop. Nice and cozy. This weekend I'm swapping out my old box. I'm replacing it with the PSC 688 SG Big Bore XD2. In addition to these tools, be sure to have some hydraulic thread sealant on hand, like Loctite 567. I went with PSC's Adventure Kit, which in addition to a high volume pump and cooler, it also includes this enormous fluid reservoir. Everything about this setup is heavy duty. I have a feeling this install is going to be an adventure in of itself, so it's time to get cracking. The very first thing I did was started removing the steering rod.
So I'm doing this slightly out of order to what the manufacturer PSC recommends. I'm doing that for you DIY guys out there, because this is one of the more, difficult steps, especially if you've got an older Jeep with a really rusted on steering rod end. So the first thing you should try to do is, just as I just showed you, hammer off the steering rod from the pitman arm, because if you can't do that, you can't do anything else on this install. And at this point, your Jeep is still drivable, so you could take it to a shop and have this entire steering assembly professionally installed.
The next thing I did was remove the wheels and propped my Jeep up so that I could, if needed, drop the front end to full droop to give me just a bit more room to wrestle the old steering box out. To give myself even more room, I removed the track bar. The bottom end is now as open as I can make it. Time to make some space on the top end. First thing to go is the airbox, then the alternator, and the coolant reservoir. Because I will be undoing the steering rod, it's very important to secure the steering wheel to prevent it from spinning wildly out of position. Now we can remove said steering shaft. It's a tight fit. Some patience will definitely be required here. Time to remove the old steering box. OEM style boxes aren't too large, so it's pretty easy to handle if you're doing this work alone, like I usually do. I was able to remove the old box without dropping the front end down. Next up, remove the high pressure line. While the old box was easy to get out, at 57 pounds, the new box is just a bit more than I could handle alone. So I got a bit creative and used my snatch block for the very first time ever. Then using my winch and a couple axle straps, I lifted the new box up and dropped it into position. With a very minor amount of repositioning, I managed to get the big bore box lined up perfectly. I snugged it down to 90 foot-pounds.
Yeah, it's really important that the red stripe is lined up before you put the pitman arm on. Now this one is keyed, so it seems there's no way of putting it on incorrectly. Like you can put it on 180 degrees backwards, but it's really hard to be off by a few degrees. Just like that. And then there's a lock washer that goes on next. And then a 42 millimeter nut. Now I'm just putting this on loosely for now. Just make sure everything lines up. But you do have to use, I'm going to use a red Loctite on that because I never want that nut to come off.
I was pretty generous with the red thread lock. I obviously have absolutely no plans to remove the pitman arm, ever. Make sure to leave a gap for the lock washer and maximize the amount of thread lock for the 46 millimeter nut.
So before you go too crazy with tightening it, you want to just test fit your track bar and make sure, so that's where it's going to sit. Make sure there's enough clearance, and this looks to be exactly the same amount as before, so I'm not at all worried about any impact. So this thing's been fully flexed on the passenger side, and you could see that there's no nicks on my track bar at all.
Once you're confident everything fits with the proper amount of clearance, torque that sucker down.
Okay, so what we have to do now is the OEM return line actually has to be cut to be removed. So, I mean, if you're at this point, this is kind of like you can't go back. So you gotta hope that you've done everything right to this point, because again, like I said, there is no going back from this.
I had to cut the OEM return line in a few places before I was able to remove it. With that out of the way, it's time to remove the old reservoir and pump. This is pretty basic, albeit a wee bit messy. I prepped the new pump with the mounting bracket on the bench. I again used red thread lock because I have no need for these bolts to ever be removed from the pump. With a bit of wrestling, the PSC pump slid right into place. I used all the OEM bolt holes. Now it's time to make some room for the new reservoir. This tab needs a 45-degree angle cut out of it. Remove the old reservoir hanger. Just like the pump, I prepped the reservoir on the bench. On the top side of the reservoir, I added some hydraulic thread lock to the 90-degree fitting and threaded it into place. I then pressed in the breather hose. Using the OEM bolt, I mounted the reservoir into place. Do not forget the aluminum washer here. Before tightening it down all the way, ensure the reservoir is pushed forcibly as close to the rad as possible. Take note of the position of this bolt. On a 3.6, it's an extremely tight fit, and the more forward you can get it, the better. Time to remove the grill. I fed the breather hose under the plastic guard atop the rad. I then mounted the breather just above my horn. It's now time to mount the cooler. Now, it did come with a prefabbed bracket. I did make one modification though. Because I have a winch installed, I drilled holes at the top of the bracket to make the installation just a bit easier. I then mounted the cooler loosely to the bracket. I installed the fittings, again applying hydraulic thread lock to the AN fittings, as well as the plugs. I drilled a pair of holes into my crossmember and threaded in the self-tapping sheet metal screws included in the kit. Everything was going smoothly. Too smoothly. Even when you think you don't have to fab something, you end up having to fab something. It's the joy of owning a Jeep. The supplied mount was too short, but in the end, it was a good thing. The cut piece mounts the cooler lower.
I actually prefer it a bit lower because I don't really want to block the airflow from hitting the rad, and it's fairly firm here. It's actually a better solution, I think. We'll see if the grill fits, because if not, I'm going to be like super pissed. Next up, I'm going to put the high pressure line in. I'm not going to show the install because it's fairly self-explanatory. The only thing to remember is to put some hydraulic thread lock on these threads, both sides, both the pump side as well as the steering box side.
The mount to the crossmember isn't quite as slick as factory. I used a pair of zip ties to secure the pressure line. Before attaching the steering shaft, remember to remove the protective rubber shield from your new PSC box. Using body panel pliers, pop off the clips for the condenser seals. Apply some Loctite 567 or your favorite hydraulic thread lock to the fittings and attach the return line to the cooler. Do not over tighten these fittings. They are aluminum, they're made in China, and they will crack. If there is one thing that didn't impress me much about this install, it's these fittings. I ended up cutting a small hole in each rubber seal to feed the return lines through.
Made in China, shit.
The feed line running from the reservoir to the pump is huge. It requires a 32mm wrench. The problem with a wrench of that size is that it's long, way too long. So I begrudgingly modified a 32mm standard equivalent, so a 1 1/4 inch, I believe. That seemed to work quite well. Make sure the 22mm fitting is facing down to ensure maximum room for the airbox. And trust me, the airbox is going to need as much room as you can give it. More on that in just a bit. The kit comes with a longer serpentine belt than factory. It's not a bad idea to get a second one to have on hand as a spare. Now reattach the alternator. Be sure to release the tension by using a breaker bar in the belt tensioner. I once again put my winch to good use. Test the tension and seating of your belt, and then move on to reinstalling the airbox. Again, this is going to be a tight fit, but trust me, it does actually fit.
It's real tight, but it fits.
Reinstall the filter, air intake, and the coolant reservoir now. I always have spare body clips on hand. I use them to fasten the rubber condenser seals back into place. Because of the winch, I had to wait until the lower grill was in place before fastening the cooler to my modified bracket. This would be much easier without a winch. Eventually, the lower grill snapped into place. I then reached through the slots with a small 4mm Allen wrench to tighten the cooler screws. Be sure to use blue thread lock here. You don't want the cooler coming loose. Button down the grill with 6 new body clips. Like I mentioned before, I actually prefer this mounting location, as the cooler is much lower than it would have been had I used the supplied mount. This setup doesn't take any extra airflow away from the rad. We're nearing the completion of the install. One of the last steps is to reattach the track bar. I also reconnected the sway bar, which I had detached for more space. Now it's time to bleed the system. Start out by filling up the reservoir. Then, without the engine running, crank the wheel lock to lock several times. 10 to 15 times is a good cycle length. The fluid level will drop. Do this several times or until the fluid stops dropping. Now it's time to turn the engine over. Just turn it over. Do not start it just yet. Do this by pressing in the clutch and the gas at the same time. Brake and gas on an auto transmission. You will see many bubbles in the reservoir, and the fluid level will drop. Do this several times. Top up the fluid and start it for the first time now. With the engine off, turn lock to lock again 10 to 15 times. Check the fluid and top up accordingly. Start the engine up once again, and this time turn the wheels lock to lock with the full weight of the vehicle on them. Mine sounded really good at this point. The fluid level was stable and most importantly, very few bubbles. I let it sit for several hours with the reservoir cap off just to make sure that there was no air bubbles remaining in the system. I then took it for a quick spin around the block.
My initial thoughts are, I'm loving it. You know, it's super easy to steer. I mean, granted, it's 2-door 35, so I mean, this box should have absolutely no problem turning these tires. But the nice thing is there's not a lot of feedback coming through the wheel. Whereas with my old box, that was my big complaint, was there's so much feedback coming back, and it seemed to be like powering out. This box does not do that, so I'm super happy. The nice thing is I have decided I'm going to be going to 37s this year, and so this system has basically future-proofed my Jeep. So I can put a Ram on if I want, and that's probably what I'll do if I feel that the 37s kind of need it. But anyways, for right now, this thing is perfect. So one thing the PSC didn't mention in their instructions, and don't get me wrong, their instructions are actually pretty good, but one thing they didn't mention was your steering rod. I had to turn mine 3/4 of a turn clockwise to shorten this rod length to correct the steering wheel. It was about 5 degrees askew, needed to correct this. It's nothing that was wrong at the pitman arm. I think it's probably just because this pitman arm is a slightly different shape to my Terraflex arm. It may be a different shape to your factory pitman arm. So it's something you do have to keep in mind when you're doing this. Don't panic. You didn't put the pitman arm wrong. You just need a small correction on your steering rod. So I just had to do a quick adjustment. That's something that you will have to take note of. But right now it's tracking straight. You know, going through bumps, and it's not. I'm not having to give it any kind of steering input at all. So I'm super happy with this install. There's a few little quirks to it. I'm not the biggest fan of the hoses. If you have a good hose manufacturer in your city or town, definitely get some aftermarket ones. The fittings are just, they're weird angles. So I would definitely recommend getting aftermarket hoses. One thing though, when you do install the cooler, make sure you're not impeding airflow. Mount it as low as you can. If you are mounting it behind the grill, mount it as low as you can, or find a spot on the bottom side of the chassis for it. As far as how long it took, I think if you're DIY, you know, give yourself a bit of extra time. You know, count on it being at least 6 hours. The Black Book, I believe, is about 4.5. So yeah, just add a little bit of extra time. So that's pretty much it. I hope you liked this video. If you did like this video, smash that like button, tap like button, just do something with the like button, and don't forget to subscribe. And right now I'm heading out to the trails, so maybe I'll see y'all there. Later.